All right. Hello, everyone. It is very exciting for me to be going first for you all this morning. My name is Emily Doctor, and today I will be presenting over my paper, Enemies of America, the American Revolution and the Downfall of the Pennsylvania Quakers, which I wrote this semester for my Revolutionary America class. And we have a lot to cover. In August of 1777, Major General John Sullivan revealed a most seditious and treasonous plot against America. He proclaimed the arbitrators of this plot the most dangerous enemies America knows, and more dangerous than even the whole collected force of Britain. And not only that, but General Sullivan accused the peace-loving Quakers of this plot. However, not long before this, these same Quakers were looked up to and respected as a political force in control of one of the largest colonies in British North America, Pennsylvania. My research investigates an episode not typically considered in the well-trodden histories of the American Revolution and seeks to answer the question of how the Quakers went from such powerful political powerhouses in the first half of the 18th century to detested by the end. I will also talk about some of the consequences of the Quakers' downfall, although it is hard to fit their whole experience into just one presentation or paper. First off, I will give some background on the Quakers. The Quakers, also known as Religious Society of Friends, emerged in the mid-18th century as a Protestant Christian religious sect that believed that each person had a little piece of God within themselves, and they rejected traditional ministry. Quakers then, as they do today, valued simplicity, honesty, and peace. And more background is that the colony of Pennsylvania was established in 1681 by Quaker William Penn, named after himself and dedicated to Quaker values and religious tolerance. And although the colony had these strong Quaker roots, waves of migration into Pennsylvania quickly turned the colony into one of the most ethnically diverse places in the world. In fact, by the mid-18th century, Quakers probably made up less than a fifth of Pennsylvania's population. Looking at the politics of Pennsylvania in the 18th century, however, shows that their political system was overwhelmingly monopolized by leading Quaker merchants that made up a sort of aristocracy in the colony. And to keep this power, Quakers manipulated power towards themselves and colonies with greater Quaker populations. Political representation rested in Philadelphia, Chester, and Bucks counties, which I have circled on the map, while western counties were delegated less representatives for their populations. Obviously, the western counties had less population, but they still were not delegated the amount of representatives that they deserved. This benefited the interests of Quakers, while others were ignored. But although this system of government had its problems, especially in the defense of the colony, the Quakers became images of morality in Pennsylvania, a society uniquely favored among Western countries. However, going into the mid-18th century, Quakers began stressing isolationist views that separated them from non-Quakers. Their religion also became more organized, getting codified in books such as the Rules of Discipline for Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which is a source that I utilized a lot for this paper. These rules, compiled throughout the 18th century, provided guidelines for Quakers in all areas of their lives, including pacifism. Codified in the Rules of Discipline is a strong commitment to pacifism and an opposition to participation in warfare of any kind. And although Quakers mostly found themselves uniform in practice and principle, they ultimately found themselves on the wrong side of history in the American Revolution. Moving into the 1770s, Quakers also found themselves in an increasingly perilous situation as colonists began to pick sides in the impending violence. Instead of picking a side, the Quakers committed themselves to a very controversial neutrality. And their neutrality was controversial in the sense that they openly fought against independence. In publications such as this and many others, Quakers openly supported the king and the English government and encouraged others to prevent separation as well. What really angered patriots, though, was how the Quakers refused to pay taxes they thought could contribute to the war. Paying any kind of penalty, fine, tax, or any kind of monetary or indirect support to the war could get you disowned from Quaker meeting, which I believe around 400 Quakers were disowned over the course of the war. Many Quakers even refused to use the continental currency at all, believing that it was created just to fuel the war. These actions greatly angered patriots that saw them as loyalism rather than neutrality, and moved simmering discontent towards the Quakers to outright hostility. And now, 1777 was an especially difficult year for Quakers. In January of that year, the British occupied Philadelphia. During this time, British soldiers specifically quartered themselves in Quaker homes because they were seen as friendly to the British, which did nothing to dissuade accusations of loyalty or loyalism to the British. And British soldiers and Patriot soldiers alike plundered Quaker homes for much-needed supplies. Later, in July of 1777, while still under occupation, Philadelphia erupted in festivities for the year anniversary of independence. And to celebrate, Philadelphians encouraged everyone to place candles in their windows. However, Quakers did not believe in celebrating independence with such a vain display, and they refused to illuminate their windows. This marked Quaker homes as easy targets for roving mobs of patriots. Up on the screen, I have a description of the events from a Quaker perspective. And as this describes, many Quakers had windows broken and other sorts of damages to their properties during this night. However, the publication of the Spanktown Papers was by far the most damaging event for Quakers during the American Revolution. There have been whole articles and books dedicated to this subject, so unfortunately I will not be able to get through all of it in just this little 10-minute presentation. But as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, on August 25th of 1777, Major General John Sullivan sent to Continental Congress a series of papers, of which I have an excerpt up on the screen. These papers revealed a treasonous plot against America perpetrated by the Quakers of the Spanktown Meeting of New Jersey to send information such as this, movements of the Continental Army to the British. And soon, these same excerpts made their way out of Congress and into newspapers, informing the general public of the betrayal of the Quakers. A newspaper is actually where I got this excerpt on the screen I have right here. Here now is part of what General Sullivan wrote in his letter, giving his opinion on the Quakers as people that frequently communicate intelligence to the British and are enemies of America. And in response to the accusation, Congress appointed a committee to investigate the matter and arrest any suspicious individuals, mostly in Philadelphia. In September, they arrested 11 or 12 leading Philadelphian Quakers. Different sources have slightly different numbers. These men were first imprisoned in the Freemasons' Lodge in Philadelphia for a week, before being loaded into wagons and carted off to Staunton, Virginia, which was then in the western frontier, far, far away from their loved ones and family, and everyone they'd ever known in Philadelphia. During their 7-month endeavor, 2 Quakers ended up dying of illness, Thomas Gilpin and John Hunt, and many of the other prisoners also fell ill. And to give a quick note, it is well established today that the Spanktown Papers were a clear forgery, since there had never been a meeting at Spanktown and they could have never gotten the information they wrote in the papers, among other reasons. So these Quakers suffered from what ultimately was an imaginary crime. It is unclear who exactly forged the documents, but it is telling that somebody forged them at all, showing just how far the Quakers' reputation had fallen and would continue to fall after the publication of the papers. And the treatment of the prisoners in Virginia would have been completely unprecedented for the aristocratic Quakers not even that long before these events. Now, jumping forward to 1781, after the Americans' win at Yorktown, once the news made its way to Philadelphia a few days later, Philadelphia once again erupted in festivities to celebrate and called once again for all to illuminate their windows with candles, a request that Quakers once again refused. Up on the screen is Elizabeth Drinker's recollection of the events in her diary, and the only image we have of her. Her diaries provide a wealth of information about Philadelphia during the time period, especially in her community of Quakers. According to her diaries and other accounts of the period, it seems that Quaker homes were particularly vulnerable to vandalism, raiding, and damage, if you can remember back to July 4th of 1777. And on a more sobering note, 1781 also saw the execution of two Pennsylvania Quakers, Abraham Carlisle and John Roberts, for the crime of high treason, among 5 individuals put to death for that crime. And while arguably it is a minuscule number, it shows that fears of treason in Pennsylvania were real, as well as the threats against Quakers. By the end of the war, Quakers had faced years of harassment, vandalism, violence, and false accusations. Not only that, they never regained the power they once had in the colony before the Revolution. Part of their downfall was due in part to their own actions, but a lot of it was also due to factors outside of their own control and fundamental misunderstandings of their religious principles. And although the situation is complex and bigger than I could cover in one presentation or paper, it is clear that the American Revolution served as the catalyst for the downfall of the Pennsylvania Quakers. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Noah Cook and I'm going to be talking about the Lavender Scare today. So, the Lavender Scare was a subsection of the Red Scare of the 1950s. The scare, if you know, was led on by the growing conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union and was led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, in which the phenomenon of McCarthyism is named after. Besides suspected communists, homosexuals were also targeted, which became known as the Lavender Scare. The Lavender Scare, led by the government's fear about the state of masculinity and the association with sexual perversion with weakness in the state, was a period of immense discrimination, in which the government looked to excise any potential dissidents, even if they had little to no evidence on them, and looked to shape society towards a heterosexual norm. However, the scare helped to shape and solidify the homosexual identity, whether through academic research that was produced at the time or the creation of an identity within the movement. So to begin, the Lavender Scare saw its inception through the association of totalitarianism and communism with homosexuality, as the concept of defective masculinity became directly associated with totalitarianism, which is used to strengthen the connection of homosexuals in the Soviet Union. Although the leadership within totalitarian states were seen as strong, the masses were often viewed as soft and their manhood as defective. A historian, in an article about the political anxiety on the state of masculinity during this period, wrote of the masses within totalitarian regimes, stating that the weakness of the masses extends to all aspects of them, even sexually. Thus, the connection of the masses within these regimes as sexually perverse led to the connection of the population that was believed to be most sexually perverse within America, which is homosexuals. So despite a fear of declining masculinity being the underlying reason for the scare, the official reasons were because homosexuals were seen as inherently un-American. Society also enforced the relationship between heterosexuality and patriotism. This relationship was formed by the American belief of the family as being a bulwark against communism. Simon Hall, in his article about designation of homosexuals as un-American during the Cold War, wrote of the family became both a symbol of and an institution that nurtured American values. The American home, populated by a heterosexual couple and their children, became symbolically and literally a fortress against the anxieties provoked by the Cold War. The family became increasingly associated as a defense against the godless, evil force of communism, and any force that could potentially undermine that connection was seen as un-American. Thus, obviously, as homosexualities don't engage in a heterosexual marriage, they became increasingly labeled as threats simply by the fact that they deviate from the norms of society. Because of this characterization, it allowed government officials to place certain attributes on them to justify their removal from governments and jobs. The moral character was often used to justify their targeting of them. It was not enough that they attacked the family structures, they were also weak, which plays into the growing concern of the state of traditional masculinity that was discussed, and easily swayed by the evils of communism. They were not to be trusted to align themselves wholly to America, because they were weak and easily swayed over to the Soviets, according to the Americans. They had no strong mooring in American identity, according to society, or many members of society, I should say. Thus, it only further made it easier to justify these programs that eventually would be taken against homosexuals. These scares and the characterizations of homosexuals allowed for widespread discrimination and firings to take place to anyone who was believed to be a homosexual. Hoover and the FBI also took a very active role in the Lavender Scare, specifically targeting anyone who might be gay. The FBI's involvement began in 1947 when President Truman created the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, which gave the FBI the ability to screen any potential job candidates to see their past views or anything else the government looked to excise. While this program came about because of Truman's desire to not appear weak on communism, which is a running theme throughout his post-war administration, and was mostly used for communist sympathizers, it soon expanded to homosexuals as well, especially because of Hoover. And then Hoover soon implemented his first of the sex deviates program, which used fingerprints and arrest records exclusively to create a list of those who were believed to be sex deviants. Soon, Hoover would expand the program as he declared the success that the program had made in weeding out and getting rid of these potential homosexuals. However, the Lavender Scare also had a profound effect on homosexuals, and not all of it was actually negative. Some of it was actually quite positive. So one influence was pushing many members of the community to embrace a white middle-class identity to fight against the stereotype that caused them to be targeted. In addition to the growing identification to this white norm of the middle class, they also looked to remove any potential subversive elements from their activism. The Lavender Scare effectively othered homosexuals so much that they looked to remove any of these elements from their population. Thus, rather than embracing their own identity, they worked to cast off the identity that had been placed on them by society. Many homosexuals also looked to place themselves within the patriotic tradition of America, fighting off that characterization that we discussed earlier of them being seen as un-American. They are just as much as part of the fight of communism as were straight members of society, that they argued. Thus, this further highlights the ways that homosexuals place themselves within the terms set out by the straight members of society, rather than setting their own path for their own liberation. Many other homosexuals, however, looked to reject this box that many of the other members of the community wanted to place themselves in, looking to live authentically. One self-described swish, which was the term at the time for more effeminate presenting men, described this interaction, criticizing many of the other groups' willingness to suppress their identity, and states that they're probably jealous of his ability to freely express himself and not live according to society's standards. Thus, this forms a divide between people who look to play within the rules of society and those who wish to live as their authentic selves. And if you look further within the queer liberation movement, that's very much a theme that still, even today, still discusses or rears its ugly head between assimilationist versus liberationist politics. And then, however, during the period, many newspapers also were written by homosexuals, which revealed the need for more public awareness of gay people. One of the first magazines that strictly dealt with homosexuals was The One magazine. Published between 1952 to 1967, the magazine looked to provide news and updates to the homosexual readers of the magazine. And then, in addition to more pop culture being produced, academic studies of homosexuals by other homosexuals also began to be produced, which helped to study many of the struggles that homosexuals face in society. One of these major works is The Homosexual in America, A Subjective Approach by Donald Webster Corey. Corey, whose real name was Edward Singarian, wrote the book because of the need for homosexuality to be studied and information to be disseminated, fighting against the systems that look to limit knowledge in these people. And then if you also know anything about the gay movement, the term coming out was also coined by him. So we can see, again, the homosexuals were allowed to write about themselves and discuss their experiences in a way that soon amplified and became staples of the gay community. In addition, new forms of activism were also introduced to help homosexuals fight against the Lavender Scare and homophobic society in general. One of these ways was to fight ignorance that was present within society. So rather than gay members educating themselves about their own identities. This looked more so at educating the general populace about homosexuals and showing them that they were normal and not these subversive elements that many tried to characterize themselves or tried to characterize them as. Thus, researchers like Alfred Kinsey performed detailed scientific study into homosexuals. His research found that homosexuality was not a moral aberration, as many believed, but rather a part of society that existed within all peoples and cultures. Thus, these studies provided essential tools for people to understand the science behind homosexuals. Another major development from the homophile movement, which is what it was called at the time, that was the main term that they used, homophile instead of homosexual. That came into more prominent usage later. Was the creation of the Mattachine Society. So the Mattachine Society started when a small group of homosexuals influenced by communist ideology came together to organize homosexuals in the defense of their rights as citizens. This group, however, did not keep its radical origins for long, as it soon adopted a more assimilationist approach, as we discussed earlier. Their focus on education rather than the advancements of their rights soon became a central feature of the Mattachine Society. That one newspaper that I discussed earlier was actually started by them. They were one of the leading forces behind the information role that the queer movement took at the time to really influence the public and also influence other homosexuals about their own identity. So this group, however, their focus on education rather than the advancements of their rights soon became a central feature of the Mattachine Society. Their newspapers and their information campaigns became their legacy rather than the work they did to advance the rights of homosexuals. So as we can see, it is a very interesting interplay between positive, really defining movement, really defining characteristics that were added into this movement by the Lavender Scare, also juxtaposed by extreme discrimination that continued to go on. So as you can see, the Lavender Scare was a very influential movement for homosexuals. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to all our guests here as well. My name is Scott Beamon, and this morning I'm going to be talking to you all about some of the research that I did into the philosophy of Che Guevara. I'm going to be looking at it through a few different perspectives. First, I'm going to look at kind of the political philosophy that he had, which, more or less guided everything that he did. Second, I'm going to be looking at the philosophy behind his economic policy which he advocated for and instituted while he was a member of the Minister of Industries in Cuba. And then finally, I'll be talking a little bit about the personal and interpersonal philosophical concepts that he expressed in some of the writings that he published. At its core, I found that the breadth of his philosophy is centered around a commitment to anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. But in order to properly analyze Guevara for what he thought, I think it's important to talk a little bit about kind of who he was. Before he became that hardened veteran who was assassinated in the mountains of Bolivia, he was just a normal youth in Argentina. Ernesto Guevara was born on June 14th, 1928, to somewhat affluent parents living near Rosario, Argentina. Young Ernestito was afflicted with asthma, and as a result, spent a lot of his youth cooped up reading and studying, making use of his parents' extensive library. Furthermore, his family was somewhat transient, so to speak, because his parents moved them around a lot in his youth to try to alleviate asthma. Despite his affliction, Ernesto Guevara stayed as active as his body would allow him to, even playing sports such as soccer and golf. But unfortunately for him, his asthma never really improved much as he got older, and it would be something that he would battle with throughout his life. This became something of a common theme in Che's life, fighting. Famously, he was a part of Castro's force, which invaded Cuba to overthrow the Batista dictatorship. And after that, he gave up his position in Castro's government so he could go and foment revolutions around the world. But one thing which truly changed him was viewing Latin America in the aftermath of the ravages of new imperialism. From that point on, his fight shifted from his internal battle against asthma into an external battle against imperialism and colonialism. in his adult life, Che would attempt to fight imperialism in all aspects of his being. Guevara was really quite prolific in his published work, especially for somebody who would eventually have such a short-lived career. And I chose a couple of his works kind of to discuss. Especially evident throughout all of his political work was that strong sense of anti-imperialism. One clear example of this is his most well-known and most well-regarded work, his book, Guerrilla Warfare. The entire nature of guerrilla warfare as a concept is one where a smaller, weaker force is fighting back against a larger, much stronger force. Therefore, that strong anti-imperialist sentiment was almost a necessity for that book to really make any sense. He touches on the Cuban example within this book, obviously, but he also makes mention of the, quote, rice-growing peasantry of Vietnam who were oppressed by the French colonial yoke. He makes it explicitly clear that his battle in life, purpose, is anti-imperial. One of his speeches, which directly attacked imperialism, was a speech fittingly titled, Colonialism is Doomed, which he gave at the United Nations in 1960. In this speech, Guevara takes note of the many conflicts throughout the world at the time and makes the argument that imperialism is the central force behind all of those conflicts. Essentially, the unstable state of the world was a result of the stabilizing force of Western imperialism. Guevara said, quote, imperialism, particularly United States imperialism, has tried to make the world believe that peaceful coexistence is the exclusive right of the great powers on earth. There cannot be peaceful coexistence only among the powerful if we are to ensure world peace. Guevara here is stating quite plainly, a world within which imperialism exists is a world without. And imperialism, in Guevara's eyes, was not something that he and the other Cuban revolutionaries turned statesmen were dealing with alone. It was a global force which Cuba had not attracted the undivided ire of. Overall, anti-imperialism is the subject of many of his written and spoken words concerning his political and military action. A common theme can see in his economic policy as well, or his economic philosophy, if you will, and the works he wrote along that as well. Guevara's vision of an anti-imperial world, led in part by Cuba, had something of a natural extension into his vision of Cuba's economic practice. First and foremost, Cuba's strategy of expropriation of foreign capital, such as Texaco and Shell oil refineries on the island, represented a step toward economic self-reliance. And of course, self-reliance is not always an anti-imperial concept. However, in the Cuban case, I think it's impossible to really separate. Because ultimately, Guevara's Ministry of Industries was not expropriating foreign capital solely to grant itself a source of revenue, nor did it do so solely to deal a blow to foreign imperialism. This action was done in equal measure to satisfy both of these criteria. Cuba needed to be more self-reliant in a post-blockade world so it could provide a meaningful quality of life to its people, but it also desired to be self-reliant in order to keep itself out of the pocketbook of, Che's words, Yankee cap. Furthermore, Guevara advocated against imperialism in his speech titled On Development, which was given before the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Within it, Che describes the relationship between Western imperialism and the West's global economic strategy as interlinked. In the speech, Guevara makes the assertion that, quote, these characteristics, that being the stagnation of development of the so-called developed countries, are not fortuitous. They correspond strictly to the nature of the developed capitalist system and full expansion, which transfers to the dependent countries the most abusive and barefaced forms of exploitation. Guevara is explicitly arguing here that capitalism and exploitation are interlinked, and therefore any exploitation on the part of a foreign nation upon an oppressed people of another nation can be interpreted as nothing less than imperialism on the part of the oppressor. Guevara points to economic institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the Inter-American Development Bank as examples of, quote, international organizations placed at the service of the great capitalist colonialist powers, essentially at the service of United States imperialism, quote. Again, in Guevara's eyes, imperialism and modern Western economics are intrinsically linked. He makes it clear that at least in his view and in the view of the Cuban people, relations with the West have thus far been almost entirely exploitative on the part of the West. In other words, they have had a relationship that can only be described as the one between an oppressed and its oppressor, an imperial power and its subject. His work in the economic field is somewhat impressive. After all, he had no real formal training in economics, yet he headed up the creation of a flawed yet resilient economic system in Cuba. His work in philosophy was similar, where he had no formal training and yet became eminently influential. Perhaps his most famous concept is the concept of the new man that would exist under socialism in Cuba. Essentially, Che coupled the concept of building socialism in Cuba and the creation of a new man with an anti-imperial struggle. In Che's view, in order to build communism, people must be reprogrammed in a way, where instead of desiring material gains from their labor, it would be inspired by moral incentives. But more than that, they would need to destroy the, quote, vestiges of the old world in their psyche. In order to build socialism, the mental effects of imperialism must also be destroyed. Guevara wanted to bring about socialism not because it would become a more equitable system in some way, or solely because the economic theory is preferable in his eyes, but instead because he saw it as the final remedy for the malady that was imperialism. Essentially, socialism could not exist in a vacuum. For socialism to succeed and usher in a new state of the world, it had to be international. And for Che, if it was to be international, it must be anti-imperial. Che Guevara was, and remains to this day, a global symbol of opposition to imperialism, oppression, and injustice. Guevara's methods can and should be critiqued and questioned. His conclusions can be debated and discussed, but certainties remain in Guevara's work. Imperialism was the greatest enemy of freedom, liberation, and life in general for the Third World and remains so. Guevara's vision of a world free from imperialism was a vision which was not limited to eliminating hard imperialist practices such as colonization and violent repression. For Che, imperialism should be fought on all battlefields it is present on, including imperialism enforced not by the bayonet, but by the bank. Finally, imperialism should not simply be rooted out of a society's institutions or by repelling an invading force. Imperialism must be rooted out from the very minds of its victims. For Che, defeating imperialism was his guiding mission in life, will be his inspiration until its end in those mountains of Bolivia. Thank you all very much.
Okay, we'll take any questions now. If you want to direct them towards our panelists.
Dr. Erickson will call on you, and I will give you the mic.
Oh, okay, all right. Professor Schuster.
Allow me to get the mic so you can all hear me. Hello. Is this working?
The mic is for recording. It's not to project to the room.
Okay. All right. First of all, thank you very much. Those are 3 great papers. And something that I found that they had in common was that you have a sympathetic character or characters that you are studying, and they have contravailing forces coming after them, whether it be Quakers that just want to remain neutral and true, but all these patriots are forcing their hand. People that want to love who they love, but there's this Cold War McCarthyism. Or someone who's an anti-imperialist against imperialists. So I'm wondering, how did you approach your subject and articulate your ideas without necessarily sounding polemic, without sounding as though you're just trying to stump for one side, keeping your academic kind of objective tone?
Don't look at me.
I can go first because I actually thought about this during my paper, because I didn't want to just portray Quakers as like completely innocent in their situation, because they definitely they did some things. they definitely had some questionable actions, but also definitely they were, like you said, they had their hand forced in a lot of things, because patriots were like, oh, revolution, like really hardcore about it. So yeah, there's definitely something I thought about in my paper, and I thought in my mind while I was presenting. I wanted to get kind of both sides of innocence and a little controversy.
And for me, I think I think it's a little harder. I think I would say most of us would agree the Red Scare was not a good thing at all, and that people shouldn't be kicked out of their jobs for whatever reason. So it was a little harder for me to kind of turn a more sympathetic light to them. I think my nuance came more talking about homosexuals and kind of the divergence between the different reactions. Some people might criticize the assimilationists for giving in to society's demands and basically playing within the rules of society, while other people might criticize the liberationists for going too far and not taking in proper like context and actually making a viable path for their liberation in society. So I think my nuance really came in at describing those discursive elements and not really picking one side or the other, not saying that one is more effective than the other, but just saying, yes, these two different perspectives of gay politics came about during this period, and it was a very influential divergence that still comes across today. And I also wanted to look at kind of their cultural products too, and seeing those as the imperfect kind of representations that they are. Obviously, within their own minds, they have their own ideas about themselves and how to come across, and that might be a little bit hard for other members of society to grasp. So I think that's also another area too that I tried to be very sympathetic and have more nuance. So that's kind of how I put in the nuance and that sympathy into my paper.
I guess sort of kind of like Noah's, I think most people will agree that imperialism is also probably not a great thing. But I think like, and this I guess is, you could say maybe like the limitation of trying to like fit such a complex topic into a speech, of just like, it's really easy, I think, to kind of get lost in a lot of Che's writings because, I mean, one, like I said, he was extremely prolific. There's a ton there. But two, like, the enemies that he is sort of presenting in his writings are not exactly that difficult. You know, it's not exactly very difficult to get behind what he's saying, insofar as, like, it is understandable that Cuba would want to be kind of more economically self-reliant, and it's understandable that they would want to kind of nationalize, you know, foreign oil companies, for example. But I guess, like, as far as not getting too much kind of on a soapbox for it, I guess it really just comes down to trying to really analyze sort of the conditions of the situation that he was in, really. Because, I mean, like, obviously, Che Guevara is definitely not a perfect person, and like I said in the speech, like, the methods that he took, you can absolutely question them. I think it's valid to do so. It's just a matter of, like, looking at the situation that he was in, looking at the conditions of the situation that he was in, and just sort of trying to keep in mind that at the core of everything that it was writing, like, that is kind of the lens to view it all through, basically. It's just like, it was this life or death struggle for him of sort of repelling this kind of foreign oppression. And so, I mean, it's sort of difficult to not kind of get lost in that a little bit, but I guess, like, just trying to keep an even keel, like, kind of, I guess, evenly measured, you know, balance between what is really happening and then kind of what he is kind of advocating for, I guess, is sort of where I ended up falling on it. Yeah.
Great, got time for another question? I think Ian had one, and then Professor Bauer.
So this question is for Emily. Given that the Quakers had such a large political power in Pennsylvania, they must have sent delegates to the Continental Congress. I just wondered if you found what the reaction was to their opinions in that Congress, and how that impacted the downfall.
Well, my research kind of ended before the Continental Congress. I kind of stopped in 1781. Definitely something I regret with my paper is that I didn't go farther because I ran out of space, and also I ran out of space in the paper because I was already covering too much. And maybe I'm just like not looking hard enough, but I couldn't find good sources for after the war. So I can't answer your question. It's something that I wish I could have answered for you. That's where I'm at.
All right. And Professor Bauer, this will be our last question, I think.
Hey everyone, it's so great to see you, and you all did excellent. Such wonderful paper. So my question is for Noah. I can't help when I hear talk about subversives, marginalized groups identified as others, and the Cold War in thinking about espionage. So what I am curious is, in your research, if you found any accusations against anyone, in the homosexual movement, or anyone identified as other one way or another, if the accusations of their subversion included being identified as spies, or suspected as spying, or suspected as working along with the Soviet Union in that.
Able to include it because obviously there was too much, but there was one he was a pretty influential figure. His name was Charles Eustace Bull, and he was actually a Soviet ambassador, and he was also part of he was part of the Secretary of State, which is one of the main areas where homosexuals were targeted. So it wasn't so much that spying came up, but obviously there was that dimension since he was so closely linked to the Soviet Union. And it's interesting too that if we look at his accusation, it wasn't even that he was a homosexual, it was that he was connected to a homosexual. So we can see that there's such weak links between these suspected peoples, but they still found these links and they were still able to connect them, especially these high up people that were working with the Soviet Union or who were working in the State Department. So there always was a little bit of that. It was more subtle with how they kind of linked him with the Soviet Union. They weren't so much to say he was a spy, because I feel like it's a powerful tool if you say you're a spy. I don't know if treason had the death penalty at that point, but treason was a very, very powerful crime. So I think they didn't want to go that far, but there was that undercurrent.
Did you find blackmail at all, or threats of blackmail?
I mean, a little bit. There wasn't. I didn't find much. I didn't have many of the actual investigations and stuff. I'd really just focused on one case study, but obviously that was another part. Hoover very much used blackmail and stuff like that in his sex deviance program.
All right, well, thank you very much. We're on to the next panel in another 5 minutes. Thanks to our